Hi. That means I probably will try to talk a little louder for people in the back, which isn't totally hard for me to do. You can hear me? Great. Okay. Um, Great. Okay. Just to start. Hi, I am Sarah Thompson, and welcome to the very first session for the weekend. It's really, I don't know, it kind of still blows my mind that you were choosing to be here to hear me speak. Yeah, so thank you for being here. And I will do more of an introduction, but before I get into that, I just kind of want to check in and see if there's anybody in the room who knows whose land we're on currently here in Seattle. Yeah. Yes. Yes. I learned this tradition from one of my Native American friends in Portland, who's also a colleague, and I just want to honor and acknowledge that we are on stolen land and we are guests here, and to honor the people whose this land does belong to. And that is a photo of Chief Seattle, who Seattle is named after. I may be saying it wrong. And then his daughter, whose name is Angeline. Yeah. So a little bit about me. I do identify as a white, queer, fat, working class, neuroatypical, mostly able-bodied person with chronic pain, non-binary person. Feels like a mouthful. And mostly I do that to acknowledge where I'm coming from and to also acknowledge my privileges, and that, you know, there are a lot of things that I have been able to do and accomplish and have ease in the world where other people haven't, and particularly, you know, like being white and being working class, you know, like I had more access to like being able to go to college and not really fear for my life as I walk through my daily life. Yeah. Also, I am an eating disorder recovery coach and a certified body trust provider. This certification is through a company in Portland called Be Nourished, and I highly, highly recommend the certification for anyone who's interested in healing body shame and or food challenges. They have had a lot of different types of professionals in the certifications. It is led by a therapist and a dietitian, just to, yeah.
And are they LGBTQ plus queer training in perspective?
Neither of them are trans or gender diverse.
Okay.
They're both cis women, and they have a module within the certification that I did. There's a whole week that talks about gender identity and eating. Yeah.
Do you teach that?
I don't teach it. It's part of the certification.
Like a trans person?
They have a lot of resources and info. It's because it's an online module, so it's not specifically taught. Is that?
They're woke, right?
Huh?
They're woke.
Yes.
Or they are
Yes.
aware of privilege and
Yes.
all the things you're
Yes.
talking about
Yes.
and how it affects queer perspective.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes. Yes. I can confidently say that. I'm also a medical advocate, predominantly for fat people who have a really hard time accessing fair medical care. And I am a consultant and trainer. I opened my business in November 2017 because I dropped out of grad school. I was going to become an acupuncturist and East Asian herbalist. And I left because the environment that I was in was so extremely fat phobic and sizist, combined with the amount of eating disorder / disordered eating teachings that my school had, and like the combination of the two, I had to choose either to continue in school or choose my mental health, and that was why I left. So, and in leaving, I decided that I needed to train healthcare professionals, and so that's predominantly what I do consulting and training on, is how to have the most beneficial relationship that you can with clients and patients of size. I'm also a writer, and I'm also in recovery from an eating disorder, and I love ice cream and Grey's Anatomy. So, yeah. So into our topic. Eating disorders are really, really prevalent. There's about 15% of Americans that will be affected every year. And just to kind of have a frame of reference for what that percentage meant, I decided to look up the prevalence of Alzheimer's, autism, and schizophrenia. And it's 4%. And I don't say that as like they shouldn't be getting attention. That's totally not the point, right? The point is that there's a lot of like unawareness about eating disorders, and it's one of the things that I do, particularly because it was part of my experience, but yeah, I'm just super excited about creating awareness about eating disorders because it's often not given as much attention. And when it is, there's a very specific stereotype of what people identify as like who could have an eating disorder. And often that is white, that is thin, that is cis and female and able-bodied. And like upper class, middle class. And so there's a lot of people growing up out there that like it doesn't even dawn on them that they like the behaviors that they're doing qualify as an eating disorder, because it like you don't see yourself in the representation, and it's just really challenging to get help for that when you don't understand that you have a problem. And then on top of that, like the systems usually are not also supporting those other identities. So,
I have a question for you.
yeah.
I'm an interact.
Fabulous. Oh, I am also, sorry, I'm just remembering to repeat your question.
Oh, okay.
For the-
Is it okay that I ask questions?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So when you say eating disorders,
Mhm.
you mean eating disorders, not disordered eating?
Correct.
Okay, because the prevalence of disordered eating
Is
versus eating
way
disorders
higher.
is like we're Americans.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just for anyone who didn't hear that the question was clarifying when I'm talking about eating disorders, I am talking about eating disorders and not disordered eating, and that is correct. So, yes, the next slide. So the types of eating disorders, great segue. So I made this presentation sort of as a 101 of everything except for the gender part, because there's going to be lots of sessions that will cover that. So just to go through the types of eating disorders that I'm talking about and what they entail. Anorexia nervosa, which is probably the most common thing that people think of when you say eating disorder, because people often also associate like an emaciated body as having an eating disorder. And while that can be true, people of all sizes experience eating disorders. And so anorexia involves food restriction, which can involve not only like the amount of food that you eat, but also restricting categories of foods. And typically there can be an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat. And then body dysmorphia, which I would say tends to be a part of most eating disorders. Yeah.
Are you going to talk about how, because I've heard providers use body dysmorphia when talking about eating disorders, but also body dysmorphia, dysphoria when talking about eating disorders. And I've always, dysphoria is kind of with a gender, and dysmorphia is more with eating disorder. Although they're very similar, they're different. Similar to
Gender
is that kind of the same
dysphoria is different than body dysmorphia. The dysmorphia is typically indicating that you don't see your body the size, like as the size that it actually is, and so you have an extremely distorted view of what you actually look like. Whereas gender dysphoria is about the incongruency of how you appear and how you feel your gender.
I guess the symptoms, or not the symptoms, the outcomes, like the feelings are really similar, so I want to
Yes.
suss that out. Thank you.
Yes. And then bulimia nervosa, which is typically binge eating followed by some type of compensatory behavior to avoid weight gain, such as self-induced vomiting, laxatives, exercise, diuretics, any other type of medication that might affect your weight. Yeah.
And restriction belongs on that list too.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people think bulimia can't include food restriction, that it's anorexia if there's food restriction, but if you're binging and then restricting for days, then.
Yeah.
That's the behavior making
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. Oftentimes, for some reason, restriction doesn't end up on these lists,
Mhm.
that people look up, but it's probably like I feel like that I've encountered like one of the most common types of compensation for the binge eating.
Yeah. So there's somebody in the audience that said that restriction belongs on the list for part of the compensatory behavior of bulimia. And I would probably agree with you, and I am using the DSM defined definitions.
4 to the 5, it probably changed, and I didn't
I don't know.
belong to
Right, I don't, yeah. Because part of that is, my response is, then that sounds like binge eating disorder to me.
Oh, right.
Because most people don't recognize that restriction is a big part of binge eating disorder. And so if you're binging and restricting, it probably
You're totally right. You're totally
qualifies,
right. I
yeah.
guess I was focusing on how people think, oh, it's automatically anorexia. It's like, no, it's not.
Yeah, yeah. And the way that binges are characterized is by a lack of control and eating more food in a short period of time than what most people would eat in a similar amount of time, which all can be pretty subjective, but there are specific like food amounts in the DSM. And then binge eating disorder, which was only added in 2013 to the DSM. Before that, it was under, I believe, the other specified feeding and eating disorders, which used to be called ED-NOS for not otherwise specified. So in BED, binges are characterized by a lack of control and eating more food in a short period of time than most people eat in a similar period of time. And there is some type of restriction typically present, whether it's some type of calorie restriction, skipping meals, or some type of dieting. And then orthorexia does not have its own listing yet. It almost made it in 2013, but it didn't. I heard that it was due to a bunch of white dudes on the East Coast emailing back and forth and deciding not to put it in. It would be classified under OSFED, which is the last thing on the slide. And it is an obsession with proper clean eating, or pure, or like not being able to eat foods that are not healthy, or whatever the person deems as like what that is defined for them. And it's really disruptive to people's lives and like social engagements, being able to socialize. And the tough thing is, I would say that the grad school that I attended predominantly landed in the orthorexia category, although the orthorexia set people up a lot of the times for binging, right? So, because even though you're eating, it's pretty restrictive to only have certain things that you can eat. So at my school, it felt extremely normal to be orthorexic. And if you weren't, that felt really uncomfortable. Yeah.
Maybe it's like how you're viewing, like if it's a positive thing for me, it's a positive thing for me, and it's probably not unhealthy. But how does like ethical eating work into that? Because I look at obsession with proper, clean, pure, healthful eating, and I instantly go to, well, I'm vegan.
I think you can be vegan without it disrupting your life.
Right, okay, so that's like, there's other symptoms that are also causing to make it a negative thing versus like, I'm just ethically eating food.
You could
Yeah.
be vegan not for those reasons. You know,
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, just
Well,
right.
yeah. I don't know.
That is a big conversation,
Yeah.
I think. And
so the conversation that is being had though is how those.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Totally. Yeah.
So in sort of speaking to that, I was just going to share my own experience with atypical anorexia, so not identified by doctors.
Mm-hmm.
It took me 25 years before I started having any health, and me like getting to the nth degree with the orthorexia, with like I had to make sure that I knew how, like if I ate meat, how it was raised, where it was raised, how the animals were treated, where it was processed, what kind of labor union was representing the meat packers, which grocery store I bought it from, and that sort of like level of obsession of wanting to always eat like the right way, and also just being like perceptive around fat causes, you know, like anemia and all of the other things that you have as health fallouts from eating disorders, but without a thin body, it just gets missed, right? So that it's just doctors saying, why does this matter so much to you? Why don't you just get over it?
Yeah. Or just eat
And
better.
also, can you lower your BMI?
Right. So, and we're doing the recording. So, somebody shared their experience about focusing on eating meat that they knew the labor union that workers worked at to produce the meat. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Almost.
The obsessive thinking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
Thinking about it.
the obsessive thinking about that interrupts the being able to eat, and then also you brought up atypical anorexia, and that is currently under OSFED too. Miraculously, like that phrase is in the DSM. Unfortunately, it still demonstrates that there is weight stigma attached to that because it's anorexia. It doesn't, I mean, it matters because the DSM says that there's a certain BMI for anorexia, and that exists because of weight stigma. So a lot of people in larger bodies have to lose a lot more weight to be seen as having an eating disorder and get help for that eating disorder, which the person in the audience talked about. There's also ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and this is a category that is probably, it's a bit different than a lot of the other categories because it specifically is like possibly people that have like texture problem, like challenges with eating certain textures, and so they have, or like people that only eat white foods or things like that that really interrupt being able to eat enough or without a lot of disruption to their life. Okay, so I already said the first point. The things that are important to know about eating disorders are that they all can happen at any size. Not looking at the DSM requirements. And a lot of people go undiagnosed and not treated as if they have an eating disorder, even if they are talking about limiting their calories, even if they're talking about exercising, 15 hours a week, or even if they're talking about throwing up, or, if the doctor that you're telling these things to isn't properly trained and able to assess for these issues, especially if you're not somebody that's thin or falls into that like stereotype of what an eating disorder looks like, then a lot of times, especially for people at a larger size, you're told to diet, you're told to lose weight, you're told to restrict, and you're told to increase your exercise, which is all of the exact opposite things that you should do when you're trying to recover from an eating disorder. Yeah, and then because there is this stereotype, a lot of resources and treatment centers and programs are geared towards cis women, which leaves out cis men even, like not just all of us who might be trans or gender diverse or non-binary or gender queer. This is even for queer people, like to sit in groups with a bunch of cis people who are like, I've heard this from one of my friends in recovery, and they're all talking about how they want boyfriends as a part of like their recovery. And I'm like, why is that supposed to be my goal of recovery? to be partnered. And yeah, so it makes treatment pretty complicated if you are lucky enough to get services. Often body dysmorphia occurs with every type of eating disorder, I said that. And then the two things that I see as like the biggest risk factors for eating disorders are trauma and dieting. This was a big thing that I learned through my certification, that I was not aware that dieting was a risk factor for developing an eating disorder. So that blew my mind. And obviously trauma includes a wide spectrum of different types of trauma. It can be It could be neglect, it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be bullying. And also like the list of things that the ACEs study addresses, which is like includes violence in your home, between your parents, and if you have a family member in prison. I think those are the things that may not specifically be on that list. Or if there's some type of substance use in your family. And then I would also, even though it's not part of the ACEs, I always really am curious about like, what if you have a family member with an eating disorder? Because I think it's somewhat similar to substance use. I don't think that food is an addiction. That's a whole nother topic. And having that be what you grow up with, I think affects you. So, but we don't have data for that because it's not in the ACEs study.
Question, I wonder, like, what your opinion, kind of as an expert in this realm, is about whether just like having like queer and trans bodies in a cisnormative society, just the trauma of that.
Yeah, like systematic depression trauma.
Like, is there, you think, a higher incidence, or what do you feel like?
Systematic oppression should be on the trauma list, I think. I'm kind of surprised I didn't include it. I imagine I talked about it. It's in one of my slides. I don't know which one. But yes, I think that discrimination and the daily oppression that people live with, whatever identity that is it's trauma. And I would say that it's probably usually the least addressed trauma, especially in the eating disorder field. Yeah.
There's a question about the bullet point of referring.
Yeah.
Is there a discussion or advocacy around getting Medicaid coverage for eating disorder treatment?
There is in Oregon. I don't know about Washington. The question was, is there advocacy or efforts being made to have eating disorder treatment covered by Medicaid? And so that's what I said. It is covered in Oregon. I'm not sure about Washington. And I think Medicare covers it. So, I'm gonna, yeah.
Do you want an answer to that?
For Washington?
We can totally talk about it afterwards.
Is the answer yes? Does it depend on the diagnosis?
It's billing, how you bill it. If you bill like for, well, oh, sorry.
So, for Medicaid in Washington right now, there's a big change coming up in 2019 about how mental health diagnoses are billed.
Okay.
So if it's separately through your county mental health organization,
Uh-huh.
your behavioral health organization, or through your managed care organization, your Molina, your United, your community health plan. So that will be changing, which will include a wider coverage for a lot of mental health diagnoses, and there is hope that among the people doing that work, that will improve eating disorder care access for Medicaid patients.
Okay. So the answer is that coverage in Washington is not great, if at all, maybe. And that in 2019 there is a change in mental health coverage that may make it possible for more access to eating disorder treatment. Thank you.
Can I tack on? I would say that there's a better like grassroots movement, and that's why referring to people who will, it's not manipulation because it's the system we have, but it's kind of manipulating the system, which is sad.
Know the people that know how to do that and send them to them.
Well, the providers who
Yeah.
are like, no, I'll bill this. I mean, it's similar with transitioning. You know,
Yeah.
like, I just have to bill it a certain way for you to get it.
Yeah.
This might just be, this is my experience. I'm feeling a little anxious
Okay.
because I want to hear more from you and get through your slides.
Okay.
And I'm just noticing that I'm feeling anxious.
I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah.
I just wanted to put that out there. And
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I will ask for less questions.
I mean, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I also really want to
Right.
get to the meat and potatoes a little
Yeah.
bit.
and I don't want to end at like slide 30 when I have 41. Yeah. So we have about, 40 minutes left. Great. So I would say burning desires, feel free to raise your hand. And anything else, please wait till the end. Great. Okay, so next slide. To somebody's lived experience. This is OJ from Third Wheel ED. If you don't know that social media account or website, go look it up at some point. It is a business created by a couple of my friends. One is non-binary and in recovery from an eating disorder, and the other is her partner, their partner. And their partner talks a lot about being a caregiver for somebody with an eating disorder, because a lot of caregiving stuff is aimed at parents. So they do a lot of work around that. And then OJ shares their experience as well as like the combination of their business. And the third wheel is the eating disorder, Third Wheel ED. They say, my eating disorder helped ease the discomfort I had with my existing physical features, in particular those markers of femininity, by disguising my feelings of anger, sadness, frustration, punishment, and shame. I tricked myself into believing I could remove evidence of femininity in the form of curves and more rounded features, and by losing my period. So sizeism is part of my talk, and it is under that umbrella of trauma, right? People being discriminated against because of their size, the bullying that happens, the inaccess to people that are fat make less compared to people that are thin. They are not accepted for job opportunities. A lot of medical care can be life-threatening if the doctor that is seeing them doesn't believe them when they report symptoms. And because a lot of people, whether it's ignorance or just out of meanness and dehumanizing factor of how people feel about fat people, you can go to the doctor for all sorts of things and be just told to lose weight as your treatment option, and not be offered the same thing that a thin person reporting the same symptoms would get. And then there's also the whole, well, I don't want to deal with being fat. Who wants to there's not very many people in our society that is not thinking about this. They exist, they do, and it's also really common. So this information, the first two things are from the National Eating Disorder Association website. They have lots of statistics on there. And 42% of first to third grade girls say that they want to be thinner. 46% of 9 to 11-year-olds are sometimes or very often on diets. And 82% of their families are sometimes or very often on diets, which I think is super important because dieting is a risk factor for developing an eating disorder. And children really aren't able to give consent for doing this thing that is going to completely disrupt their metabolic process, their puberty, their growth, and it really is really challenging. Most of the people that I know that talk about being in recovery from an eating disorder, a good majority of them started dieting when they were in the 9 to 11-year-old category, myself included. So then there's a lot of research also that has been studying the weight bias among medical professionals, everything from nurses to doctors, dentists. There's one study that exists about eating disorder professionals, and it's extremely eye-opening. And so often, medical professionals associate fat people with poor hygiene, non-compliance, hostility, dishonesty, lack of intelligence, and weak will. You can see that a lot of these terms are pretty commonly also used as like how people who don't think highly of queer people or a lot of marginalized groups. Like there's some overlap in how people are viewed. Weight bias decreases a provider's ability to be patient-centered while interacting with larger patients. Physicians may over-attribute symptoms and problems to obesity, like I was saying earlier, and fail to refer the patient for diagnostic testing or to consider treatment options beyond advising the person to lose weight. If you're ever interested in hearing lots of stories, do a Google search. In a different presentation that I give that specifically talks about how to do weight-inclusive healthcare, I start my presentation with an article that talks about how somebody's cancer went undiagnosed for 5 years. It was lung cancer, and she just kept being told to lose weight. There's somebody who had a broken leg. The first ER that she went to, she was told just to lose weight. They never did an x-ray. She went to another doctor. They did an x-ray, and her leg was broken.
Lots of commonalities with trans.
Yes, yes. Access to healthcare is, I really want to swear right now. Yeah. Which has a huge impact on wellness and like how you can like be in your life, right? And the last point, this is based on that eating disorder professional study. 42% perceived that other eating disorder practitioners who treat people with eating disorders often have negative stereotypes about obese patients. I also realized that I did not put that in quotations or add according to BMI because I work really hard to not ever use the O words, whether that's overweight or obese, because they're extremely stigmatizing. And like the root of the word stems from like you are a large size because you eat so much. And that is super reductive and not accurate for a lot of people. Body diversity exists and will always exist. This quote is from a gender flex femme. Another way that fat phobia impacts my gender expression is that many folks consider thinness to be integral to androgyny. Sometimes I feel like my curves disallow me from ever being seen as non-binary. Even people who claim to recognize non-binary gender seem to think there's a certain look you have to have, which includes being thin. It's discouraging because I'd have to lose a couple 100 pounds to feel like my body is truly androgynous, in parentheses, thin. This quote is from one of the people that was in the group of people that founded Health at Every Size, which is a paradigm alternative to the weight-centric model that the medical model exists in. and which Health at Every Size essentially states that body diversity exists, dieting is harmful, let's see how we can be well without attempting to change our body size. She's also a therapist in the Bay Area, and this is her quote. I'll read it. Our medical system prescribes the same behaviors to fat people, parentheses, extreme food restriction, that it discourages for people who struggle with anorexia. I think the first time I heard that, that really blew my mind too, because I never saw what I was doing as the same behaviors as anorexia, because I was so convinced that my size was wrong and the answer was to restrict and the answer was to exercise. A little bit more about the impact of weight bias and stigma. Medical professionals' attitudes about obesity may cause their patients with obesity to feel disrespected, inadequate, or unwelcome, thus negatively affecting the encounter quality and their willingness to seek needed care. I have a friend who avoided the doctor for 10 years. That she's now, in the past few years that she has been accessing medical care, she identifies as super fat, and in the time that she's now been accessing medical care, she's been diagnosed as having sleep apnea, adrenal fatigue, which are all things that interact and could have been treated much sooner and probably not worsened to the effect that they did. I do believe that most healthcare providers are trying to deliver compassionate care. I generally believe that. And they may have glaring blind spots. Implicit bias is a thing. When you don't know that you're biased, you don't know that what you're doing is harmful. And this definitely impacts patients to the core, and is a major hindrance for people at higher weights to access and receive equitable care. This is a quote from this cited research article. As a patient's BMI increases, physicians report that they have less patience, less desire to help the patient, have less respect for these patients, and see them as a waste of time. You can see why people avoid the doctor. This is from another person that identifies as non-binary. It is difficult being fat and non-binary, as no one believes that I am non-binary because of the way I look. It took me a long time to come out to people as non-binary for this reason, and an even longer time to ask people to use they, them pronouns. Not only am I fat, but I have the coveted hourglass shape that means no matter what I wear, I will always be read as female. And I actually like the shape of my body. It's just how others label it that gives me dysphoria. For the longest time, I was convinced I couldn't be non-binary because I wasn't thin and androgynous looking. And when I was younger, I spent so much time trying to be more ladylike, since I was constantly scolded for not being ladylike, that it didn't even occur to me to question whether or not I was a lady. It was really interesting collecting these different stories from people, and it had a really big impact on me and my gender identity. And because I saw so much of myself in what people were submitting as their experience.
So these quotes are quotes you compiled yourself from people you've worked with?
Not people that I've worked with. It was, I asked for people to share their experience in like social media and had them email me their responses. Yeah. So gender and eating disorders. Most of the research began on transgender people in relationship to eating disorders in 2013. It's not a very long time. Most of you probably will not be surprised by the statistics, even though they're still, I feel like they're just really stark, I feel like, to read them. These were all taken from the National Eating Disorders.org page. Transgender college students had over 4 times greater risk of having been diagnosed with anorexia or bulimia, and 2 times greater risk of eating disorder symptoms such as purging compared to their cisgender female peers. In another study of transgender Canadian youth, they found that youth who experienced more frequent harassment and discrimination were more likely to have eating disorder symptoms, while those who could draw on protective factors like supportive schools and caring friends, I would say family, but sometimes that's absolutely not available, were less likely. And then the last thing on the slide is transgender individuals who received gender-affirming medical intervention had improved body satisfaction and lower eating disorder symptoms after receiving gender-affirming care. There's a brand new study that's out this year that was done through the Trevor Project. It was in combination with NEDA and an eating disorder center that the name is escaping me at the moment. But it's really easy to find if you put in Trevor Project's national survey. It was released in February in conjunction with Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And they surveyed a spectrum of LGBTQ youth. I believe the age was like 14 to 24. And they found that half of the LGBTQ youth surveyed, let me back up. 54% of the participants indicated that they had already been diagnosed with an eating disorder. Of those diagnosed with an eating disorder, 58% have considered suicide. The thing that's up in the top bullet point is that, so there's the 54% that's already diagnosed with an eating disorder. Of the other 46%, half of those people said that they suspected that they had an eating disorder, which makes the statistic probably closer to like 75%. And then of specifically the transgender respondents, 71% had been diagnosed with an eating disorder. I think something to consider is that often people that are seeking gender-affirming care are required to have mental health access, and so they might be more likely to actually get a diagnosis because they're already seeking mental health care. I'm not sure how we would ever tease apart maybe that the higher risk. Not that I don't think it exists, just that that's a factor. This person identified as non-binary to F to M spectrum. I believe this person was from Canada. I find that the relationship between gender, my body, and food to be really complicated. I have had bulimia since I was a young teenager, and my eating disorder is greatly connected to my issues with my gender. When my eating disorder started, part of the reason was I wanted to lose weight so that my body would match what I felt like. I continue to struggle with bulimia, and now that I have come out about my gender, I am being pressured by my breast surgeon to lose weight, despite just being an intensive outpatient for bulimia. For me, food seems to be the enemy of my gender and my body. To me, it feels like I have to choose between having an eating disorder and being my authentic gender. We've probably already talked about all of this. So this is kind of a summary of like why are we more at risk? Trauma, there's obviously with trauma comes a higher risk for PTSD. There can be fewer protective factors with family and community. If you have any other part of your identity that is discriminated against, like the compounding intersections of maybe being a person of color and being fat and being trans, that's all cumulative. That's a lot to live with. Can be a lot to live with if you don't have the protective factors. And then we talked about body dysmorphia, gender dysphoria, the poor treatment options, because a lot of eating disorder professionals are not educated about trans and gender diverse issues. And then the possibility of being underdiagnosed, especially if you're a person that doesn't fall into that emaciated category, because there's a lack of education and understanding among healthcare providers and the lack of not feeling comfortable to seek care. The image on the left was created by Third Wheel ED. It basically shows how complicated and confusing it is to be dealing with size, body image, eating disorders, and gender identity. I've had several people tell me that's what it feels like, how all over the place it is. And then the person on the right is Jay. They have a website called Comfy Fat. It might be comfyfattravels.com, and are on Instagram. This next quote is from them. They don't specifically talk about, they don't specifically identify as having an eating disorder, at least in the article that I'm referencing. I have no idea what their experience is, so I'm including Jay as a representation of how size and gender interact away from food. So this is from Jay's article titled "How Fat Phobia Impacted My Gender Identity." When you live in a fatphobic world that forces you to distance yourself from your body all of your life, you may not be super in touch with or think about gender. Gender dysphoria came up, but I didn't understand the feelings. I was too preoccupied with trying to shrink myself to explore any feelings about gender. I was super uncomfortable in my skin, but I'd shove any feelings about gender way deep down below the shame of my fat body. It was like going to war every day with the fatphobic world, only to come home at night and be at war with myself. I distanced myself from my fat body and any feelings attached to how I really wanted to present myself for moments of peace, for survival. I'm probably going to go a little quickly through the next few slides. And my presentation is available on the website to download. I also have a handout on the website to download that is kind of like a resource PDF that includes highlights from the thing. So feel free to download both. So reasons why food and gender are a way for people to cope or control their body size. There's a lot of things that we've talked about, dealing with the discrimination, whether it's workplace, medical, or societal, being misgendered, family rejection, the lack of access to gender-affirming surgeries or healthcare, which can be based on BMI. Not wanting to be misgendered by others, so trying to control your body size because that's easier than changing society. And then gender dysphoria and wanting to have your body appear more like what you want it to be or how you feel. a lot of people are told to lose weight to access surgery. I was super excited to see a post by, who was it? A doctor last night who's going to be here at the conference and has the triangle pins that says all bodies, I forget what it is. Because in their Instagram post that I found last night, they specifically said, we do not have a BMI requirement for top surgery. And that's can be super rare. And then wanting to have control over one's body, not having a way to connect with one's body and wanting a different experience in your body. And also a way to harm your body if you feel betrayed by it. A body that may feel like it hasn't given you what you wanted. This art is from a Instagram account that I follow. I think it's called Healing Crayons. They do a lot of eating disorder based art, which is really, really fun. I don't think that they're trans or gender diverse. I just like their art. And for anybody who can't necessarily read it, they wrote comparison sucks 5 times. And then and then at the bottom it says, well done, 100%. And that was the image at the beginning where it had this tsunami image of all of the different things that went into creating their eating disorder. That was also Healing Crayons. So then I decided I kind of did a teensy experiment and wanted to see if any fat people came up when I searched I think it was famous transgender people I put in. The closest I got was Chaz, who has lost weight since their transition, which is absolutely no judgment. It's just like, that's the representation for fat people and trans. Yeah. I'm going to skip that quote. The article is available online. Oh man, this is what happened. We have 10 minutes. So I'm going to also skip this one because this quote from Sand, actually, no, I'm not. I'm not going to skip this one. But Sand's interview is available on online. It's the link is in the PDF that I have online, and it's a podcast interview on a podcast called Food Psych. Growing up, I felt othered anyway. And so, the experience of being different, I can say it was because of this, or because of my size, or because my parents are immigrants, and I'm Chinese American. You can tell it's like a talking interview and not written. Or because my gender didn't feel right. There are ways that I presented myself gender-wise in terms of my gender expression and sexuality, and how I was mediating managing my appearance and weight ties into that. And of course, a lot of this, I'm very suspicious about anyway, because the ideals that we have for what trans bodies are supposed to look like are based on white, skinny, sort of model-looking people, and it really excludes folks who are, fat, disabled people of color. And they identify as a transmasculine, non-binary, genderqueer femme, and they're a psychologist in the Bay Area. The same exact thing came up when I put in androgynous. I don't even think that a fat person came up at all. And I love these people, right? Like, this was the first non-binary actor. Alok is just amazing and hilarious, and Andrea Gibson. I'm going to skip that because it's a lot of what we've talked about already. This is from an article by Caleb Luna, who their article was called "The Gender Nonconformity of My Fatness," and it's on a website called "The Body Is Not an Apology." It's also listed in the resources in the PDF, and I'm going to read it. Further, Black, queer, gender nonconforming activists and scholars, most notably, I don't know how to pronounce this person's name, Saidiya Hartman, have theorized how gender is always already racialized. Under colonialism, racialized and colonized people and Black folks especially are set against a white gender standard that we will always fail. We are always set against white masculinity and white femininity, which are always already cis, muscular, or thin, and not disabled. The more I've experienced this, the more that in some ways I feel like my fatness arrests my gender. Regardless of how I feel and how I view my gender, there are material limits to what gender my body is allowed, or more appropriately, disallowed to access. While I don't have a desire to participate in it, I feel like my fatness has excommunicated me from masculinity and perhaps gender as a whole. The closest I can come to articulating my gender is fat, and even this feels like offering more than what is deserved, like retrofitting a body to a system that never wanted it. There's a quote from Ryan Salins, who is a trans man and wrote the book Second Son. From the searches that I did, it is the only account of a trans person in a book talking about an eating disorder. I'm gonna skip it though. Where do we go from here? Before I completely run out of time, I'm going to pass around a couple of things, and if you want them, take them. If you don't. Not offended. And then I'm also going to pass around an email list in case you would be like to be added to the email list that I do for my business. Thank you. Okay. So, where do we go from here after we've talked about all of that really intense, stark stuff? Like I talked about earlier, stop using obese and overweight unless you are qualifying it by saying as defined by BMI. Be more mindful of how your clients talk about their bodies and about food. Words that or phrases that you can use in place of obese or overweight are this third bullet point: larger bodied, higher weight, high end of the weight spectrum. Also, I'm just going to add the caveat: ask your patient or client or whoever you're talking to what word they prefer. Yeah.
And if weight doesn't need to be a qualifier, leave it out. Often people label people, it's like that they're a person of color, that they're trans, or that they're a higher weighted person, and that has nothing to do with what we're talking about
Yeah.
at all. So just like leave it out.
Yeah. So there was a comment from the audience that if the qualifier identity marker that you're talking about has no bearing on what you're talking about, leave it out. I could go off on a tangent on that, but we're going to leave it at that.
I'm happy to listen to your attention later.
Focus on diagnostic testing rather than weight and BMI. A lot of people do not know that the effects of chronic dieting, intentional weight loss, disordered eating, all have the same things that are attributed to obesity, and that does not get factored into a lot of things.
Could you please define briefly disordered eating?
It would be basically like a subclinical, they don't qualify and meet the criteria for the DSM specific clinical eating disorder. So it's this, so the question was, can I define disordered eating? And so I would say it would be the subclinical presentation of food is a disruptor, but somehow you don't fit in these categories. Thanks for asking. I think it's super important to increase advocacy work to decrease reliance on BMI requirements for surgery. And then include and or start learning about Health at Every Size, which is a book that came out in the 2000s. And there's a follow-up book called Body Respect, written by the same author. And there is a book also called Intuitive Eating. And there are lots of resources available online if you put any of those in as a search term. And I feel like those absolutely need to get integrated into trans and gender diverse healthcare. And it's like a microcosm of our greater healthcare system a lot of the time, which doesn't include these things. I highly recommend people curate their social media because when what you look at changes, what you see changes, or something to that effect. So this is a list of trans gender diverse accounts, and there's probably like 2 or 3 on there that probably don't qualify as like chubby or fat, but a lot of them are. I'm going to skip that quote. Part of what I did was collect people's responses about what they wanted their providers to know. And I think I'm going to tell you to go read the PowerPoint. I'm sorry. And so this quote, because, I come from this body trust framework, I do want to say this quote by Dale Hayes. Body trust is not in any sense of the word a diet. Body trust is an internally directed process, a gentle way to care for yourself for the rest of your life. Trusting your body means getting in touch with inner signals and letting your body sort out the weight question itself. And while I have such long discussions with one of my colleagues, and he's trans, and this whole discussion about body trust and what the implications are for queer and trans people, and while I think that there is often this sense of feeling betrayed by your body, I also kind of view people who are able to recognize that their gender is different than what they may have been assigned at birth, and then go through this process to align those two things. To me, that feels like innate trust in your body, because you're able to recognize that and follow that, and I feel like that can also be a really long discussion, because it is so complex, and it does vary from person to person and what your individual experience is. And then this is a slide on going into detail about what these modalities are. I have 2 minutes. And then there's a slide on redefining success, which I think is super important when trying to get out of the weight-centric model, because there are lots of ways that we can take care of ourselves and pursue wellness without focusing on healthism or focusing on having a thin body. There's a list of resources. And then this, I actually was interviewed for the podcast Food Psych, and it was before I came out as non-binary. So I don't talk about that at all in the interview. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is read these questions, particularly for people who hearing weight inclusive healthcare, hearing about weight stigma may be super new and uncomfortable, to have some questions to think about, and to also maybe think about as you go through the weekend and hear people present on different topics. Can you be curious about the circumstances when you recommend weight loss and what happens when you do? Can you be curious when you assume a problem is related to weight? Can you be 100% sure it is weight related? Can you take some time periodically to identify your implicit biases? Can you take a moment when you're in the room with someone who lives in a larger body and be curious about what assumptions you are making about their health and their history? Can you be curious about the role of culture, constructions of beauty, and structures of oppression like patriarchy and white supremacy have on your assumptions about health and eating habits? What can you do to make your practice more accessible and welcoming to a diversity of sizes and histories of food and body issues? And then this is just an info slide on me and my website. Feel free to email me. Feel free to stop me at any point during the weekend if you want. I am going to have people go out into the hallway to, if anybody has questions and wants to talk, I'll be out in the hallway. And then just a reminder, CEUs, the info for it is on page 22 of your book. And then my very last request, I'm sorry for anybody who's like super anxious to get out of the room. Would anybody have an issue taking a selfie? Awesome, all right. So, the last thing. Yeah. Do you want to be in it, Emma?
Sure.
Okay. No, go sit. I'm sorry?
Just anybody. PowerPoint, where's the PowerPoint?
It's on the Gender Odyssey website.